Okay, so we've talked about the central nervous system. We've talked about the uh, neurons versus glial cells. So basically now we're looking at the peripheral nervous system. So remember that the central nervous system, brain and spine, responsible for integration, processing, prioritizing, all of this stuff. So information comes in and we decide what to do with it. But the peripheral nervous system is literally everything else. It's all of the sense organs sending information in, and it's all the responses coming from the brain. That is the central nervous system. So all of this is considered part of the central nervous system. Literally everything outside of the central nervous system. So if we look at the sensory nervous system, notice that we have what we consider sense organs. Now, the most obvious source of sense organs are your eyes, your ears, your nose, the pressure receptors within your fingers and skin, the nociceptors, which are pain receptors, various parts of your body, proprioceptors, which help you know your position, then you have hot and cold receptors, etc. But it's not just exclusively external, because remember, sensory information can come from internal as well. An example of an internal receptor would be something like a baroreceptor. These baroreceptors found in your aorta, and it helps to monitor the blood pressure that the heart produces. So if you see changes in blood pressure, you see subsequent changes in how the heart beats. Now, the motor division actually is divided into two parts. We have what's known as somatic, so voluntary, and then we have the autonomic, or the involuntary. So everything you're aware of in terms of response goes by the somatic division. So this is skeletal muscle. Everything that you're unaware of that just kind of happens, those vasodilation and constriction of your blood vessels, changes to how you digest, modifications to blood flow in other parts of the body, whether you are digesting food and relaxing or stopping the digestion because you have to do something, that's all the autonomic. Now, the one thing to remember about the motor division is it's not just called the motor division because it's the effector. It's called the motor division because all of the neurons here are motor neurons. They stimulate some kind of an action, and it's invariably some kind of muscle, whether it be cardiac, smooth, or skeletal, and glands. So it's really, you want to make sure you get this part here. Now, the autonomic is further divided, and we'll talk about that. And this division is into what we call the E's or the D's. So the E's are exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment. In other words, fight or flight. You are pinned into a situation, you've got to escape. The thing is that's interesting is that exercise is really a fight or flight. It's that same mechanism that gets triggered. The parasympathetic is then housekeeping, maintenance, digestion, defecation, diuresis. So if you can keep the D's and the E's straight, you're in good shape. Now, the anatomical differences between the two are both in terms of location. So you can see the parasympathetic comes from the brainstem and the upper part of the spinal cord, as well as from the pelvic region down here. Whereas the sympathetic is, look at it from T1 all the way, coming all the way down into the lumbar region. And so we have exits controlling this. Notice also that they're pretty well controlling the same organs, the same, the lungs, the heart, the eyes, and everything, but they're producing very different effects. The second anatomical difference you need to know is the location of the ganglia. So remember that a ganglia is when the neurons, the nucleus, and that the part that we consider that's typically located within your central nervous system is actually external to the central nervous system, and that's what we call a ganglia. So the sympathetic ganglia are actually very closely tied to the spinal cord. You see them very close in terms of proximity to the spinal cord compared to the proximity to the organ they're triggering. Conversely, notice that the parasympathetic, the ganglia is really close to the organ that we're triggering. So we have a really long axon coming out to these to trigger them for their particular response. Now, a couple of reminders about what a nerve really is. So we've been talking about nerves as though it's the neurons and things like that, when in reality, nerves are bundles of axons. So we see a similar organization. You have an endo, an epi, and a peri. Notice now that we're using the term neurium. So we have the neurium to imply nervous system. So when we have a nerve, Basically, this is a bundle of fibers, neuron fibers, typically a bundle of axons. And the neuron fibers are then bundled into connective tissue, and this is your epineurium, your endoneurium, and your perineurium, just like we saw the epimysium, the paramysium, the endomysium within the muscle. It's also why you see a periosteum and an endosteum within the skeletal system. Now, the other thing is to notice the classification of nerves. And this plays into what we talked about again with the spinal cord in terms of how the spinal cord is organized, because every signal has to come through the spinal cord, either entering and leaving, and so there's that anatomical organization. We see something similar with with nerves. So mixed nerves carry sensory and motor information. That means you have dedicated areas that are taking information in and sending information out. You also have nerves that are simply sensory and nerves that are simply motor in terms of their role. Now, in speaking about the cranial nerves, what's interesting about the cranial nerves is these are the nerves that exit the brain directly. There's 12 pairs. Guess what? You got to know all 12 pairs. The nice thing is your book has this really nice diagram and the table. So just take the time to make the link between the nerve and its action. So you can notice here, remember that we have the oculomotor. That kind of gives you an idea in terms of the optic nerve that controls eyes, etc. So notice that I have an optic nerve, which is the sensory vision, the oculomotor, which is associated with the movement of the muscles around the eye. In other words, your ability to roll your eyes when you hear me say that you have to know all of this, etc. So you can see what's going on, and they're named simply 1 through 12. Now the spinal nerves are named by their location, named by where they exit, so between the vertebral columns that they exit, because remember the nerves exit the intervertebral spaces, the intervertebral foramen, and those foramen are created by stacking the vertebrae. But more than that, they're also bundled into what's called a plexus. So you have a cervical plexus, so cervical vertebrae up here. You have a brachial plexus, which is associated with the arm. We have the lumbar plexus, which is over there in terms of the lower back, and then you have a sacral plexus, so bundle of neuron nerves that are exiting the sacrum. And it simply goes back to that bundle of nerves. Now, remember that spinal nerves exit the different parts and can go with the different parts of the spinal cord. So you have dorsal roots, you have ventral roots, and so you have a similar organization. And so you can see what areas they serve. So your dorsal serves your skin and muscles of the posterior trunk. Your ventral forms the networks for the anterior area. Now, just like when we talked about simple reflexes, we have autonomic and somatic reflexes. The somatic is what we typically think of as the simple reflex. We've already saw that when you hit your knee, the patellar ligament in the knee, and the leg kicks, etc. But we also have autonomic reflexes, and these are rapid, quickly responses to specific changes within the body. But a reflex is a reflex, whether it comes from the autonomic or the somatic. Now, continuing with our anatomies, when we look at this, the main thing is, again, this ties back into what we talked about earlier. Again, focusing primarily at the location of the ganglia and the distance that the nerve travels. So the primary thing you're going to get here is basically it's exactly what you saw in that diagram. However, here they discuss the neurotransmitters. So parasympathetic, we look at acetylcholine as the primary neurotransmitter. Within the sympathetic, though, now we run into norepinephrine and epinephrine. Basically, norepinephrine and epinephrine are the neurotransmitter versions of adrenaline. So that kind of makes sense if we're talking fight or flight and the E's. Now, more importantly, when we look at the differences, you can see that we have a single motor neuron for the somatic. The autonomic, we have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron, because we have a ganglia, and that's the cell body outside of the central nervous system. Again, other differences include what the effector organs that are triggered. So we said it was always muscle and glands. We'll notice somatic is always skeletal muscle. Your autonomic is always smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And the neurotransmitters vary depending upon what's going on. Now, this is a really nice summary diagram of everything that we've talked about in terms of the anatomical differences between the different motor divisions of the nervous system. And one last thing I want to point out as well is notice the myelination that's occurring, okay? And remember what we talked about in terms of why neurons are myelinated. And this has to do with the saltatory conduction. So by having myelination, you can see the speed that it travels versus the time it takes if it's unmyelinated. So the speed alone is really important in terms of how we produce the responses we produce, how reflexes are going to be quite quick because of their need, etc. Now, you can see the sympathetic. We have a ganglion, and then we have the receptor over here. We have the central nervous system going directly. It actually synapses directly with the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is what's responsible for producing adrenaline when it goes through the blood vessels, and then that goes to other glands. And the parasympathetic, you can see we have a ganglia that's very close to wherever we're going to trigger, especially in terms of muscle. So notice the difference all around.